Yeah, it's quite interesting to look back, and realize that I was a very lucky young film student back in the 1980s, because I actually met both Lino Brocka and Ishmael Bernal, and not only just met them, they become a close acquaintance. We were together in international film festivals, in forums, in panels, in outreach programs. But previous to that, I was this, young, starting out filmmaker, doing short films. And I was lucky to listen to them, give lectures. They would give their time to do talks in the film workshops, in the seminars that would be held in the UP Film Center. Eventually, other institutions like the Cultural Center would have an outreach program. So I was lucky enough to have listened to them very early on, and then eventually even getting to know them. Lino Brocka was very supportive of the young filmmakers, and in fact, I have to say he actually gave me my break to attend the very first international film festival, uh, where my short films were screened, as a program. It was in 1986, when after the EDSA revolution, Lino was very, very busy because he had been uh, invited to be part of the Constitutional Commission in drafting the revised constitution. And so he was being invited to the Edinburgh Film Festival, one of the oldest international film festivals, and he couldn't attend it. So he told the film programmer, the British film programmer Tony Raines back then, why don't you invite these new young filmmakers, instead of me, And then he mentioned me because I didn't know him yet, but he mentioned me because he had read about my short films, at the UP Film Center. And Tony Raines went to the Mobile Fun Film Institute and saw all the short films there and decided to program my film. So in a sense, Lino gave me my first break, to attend the first international festival. And eventually, later that year, it was quite an opportunity. I was invited to the Hawaii Film Festival, and in that same festival, Lino Brocka and even Eddie Romero was attending, the festival, and so we were like three generations representing the Philippines back then. Like Eddie Romero, as though he were my grandfather, and then Lino Brocka, and then my generation of young, short filmmakers. So to me, that was a very, very memorable event. I attended it early that year. I attended the Edinburgh Film Festival, and so it was, I was very grateful to Lino, because if he wasn't busy with the Constitutional Commission, I may not have been invited that year. So it was a very enriching experience, because it happens at the same time as the Arts Festival in Edinburgh, which is what it's really known for. At the Edinburgh Film Festival, I showed a whole program of my Super 8 short films, about five of them. So by that time, I was sort of gaining recognition already for the short films I was making, locally, through the local film competitions and short film festivals. That marked my first time to be able to show it to an international audience. There were like short talks, so we as Filipino filmmakers, would sit in the panel, and then I was also so nervous because Lino Brocka, I think, for the first time was watching my short film, so he attended my short film screenings then, and he was even with other international film programmers. So during that time, of course, there was no internet, there was no social media, there was no easy way to promote your films and to promote yourself as a filmmaker, and the only way was to be seen, in these events, and so it becomes a chain reaction. So with Lino recommending me and with other film programmers seeing the films, one thing would lead to another, and so I found myself traveling to many other international festivals after that. I can't quite recall now how he reacted, but he did say he enjoyed the films. That's how I just remember after the screening. Uh, and as I said, I really felt nervous because, I already looked up to Lino Brocka then. We've always made these films as our study in the film workshops I was attending, and as a student in the film workshops, and then of course Lino was already a highly celebrated Filipino film director. In fact, if I remember right, he was sitting with Pierre Rechant, who was a foremost film programmer for the Cannes Film Festival back in the 70s, and he was very responsible for bringing Lino's cinema to Cannes. And they were sitting in the audience of that screening in 1986. So that really made me have cold feet. But yeah, they seem to have enjoyed it. They saw it as a form on its own, that the short films need to be seen, as a different form of cinema, as opposed to what is considered official cinema, which is the mainstream cinema. Actually, Eddie Romero himself also mentioned that. I think that was one of his very kind of gracious comments. He was saying, that the young filmmakers are treading onto ground that has never been, touched by other filmmakers in the Philippine scene. So he felt that experimental cinema, short films should flourish, and that this would be the future of cinema as a whole.
And as it is right now.
So as we witness, of course, independent cinema, blurring the lines now with mainstream, and because of all other formats, we see that the origins, really had its beginnings in the short form. And so I always felt the support of filmmakers like Lino Brocka and Ishmael, Bernal, and Eddie Romero on this very important point. Yeah, looking back, I really felt so small. Here I was, this young, short filmmaker with these very, modestly produced, low-budget short films. Shot on a very low-end format. Super 8, I was still students today. That was our digital. It was the only way you could make the films, and yet at the same time I was very proud because I was sitting there, in a panel amongst these giants, Eddie Romero and Lino Brocka, and basically representing Philippine cinema as a whole. And so for me that was groundbreaking because it was recognizing our contribution, or the beginnings of our contribution, the short film and the independent underground film, to be part of cinema as a whole. Definitely, I would say Lino was very generous. He was very supportive and helpful to other filmmakers, and he really supported the movement of independent film. He was a close ally with the University of the Philippines Film Center. He talked in seminars and workshops, and plus that on that personal level, I was very grateful to him, to have recognized that, and particularly mentioned me to Tony Raines, the British film critic who was programming for Edinburgh. Lino Brocka was in fact one of our inspirations, if we can call our generation a movement on its own, because I do call it as a legitimate movement. It was a movement of filmmakers who did not necessarily want to be, a major part of the movie industry. Not to say that it was against that industry, but basically trying to create a cinema on its own. And I think the key word wasn't really independent. The independence was only part and parcel of it. I think the key word really was alternative. We were creating an alternative cinema. And I always believe that our inspirations from the mainstream, you know, like Ishmael Bernal, Mike De Leon, and Lino Brocka from the 70s, you know, they were legit independent filmmakers. That's exactly what they were trying to do in the 70s. They were finding other ways and other means to produce their own films within the system, within the industry. Whereas our generation, who was inspired by them, thought we would do our own cinema underground or outside of that, you know, so that it can actually coexist. That's why I always say alternative is the key word there. Yeah, actually, after, especially after the trip in Hawaii, he became kind of like a friend. You know, he would always be, you know, supportive in our projects. I was at the Mole Fun Film Institute. You know. We would show, you know, his films in the small festivals that we would organize. And, I even got to, you know, visit him in his house whenever he had these international film programmers as guests. You know, so I was quite privileged that I got to chat with the Lino Brocka, you know, in those early years, and it was really very sad and tragic. You know, when I was shooting my first full-length film in 1991, when I was in production for Bayani, which was my first long film, when we heard about Lino's accident, you know. So that was, yeah, an unforgettable time, really, because there was, you know, I wish he could have seen my first full-length film. So those were really critical times for cinema, because the beginnings of independent and alternative cinema were just starting to, you know, get off the ground and starting to get the recognition that it deserved. You know? I mean, fast forward to today, it's the norm now. It's highly recognized, and as I say, the lines are blurred now between, you know, the demarcation between what is mainstream, what is independent, you know, and because of the different alternative means of distribution now, it's practically really, you know, consolidated all of cinema now. Back then, it was a real struggle. It was an effort, you know, and the struggle was for decades. So I always say the struggle really began with that movement of, you know, filmmakers like Lino Brocka, Ishmael Bernal, and Mike De Leon, and many others in the 70s. They were referred to by film historians and critics as the Philippine New Wave. You know? There was a golden age in the 1950s for cinema, which is, you know, the mainstream commercial industry. The 70s marked what they called the new wave, wherein filmmakers were really out to do work, you know, through alternative and independent means, you know, and basically creating cinema which would otherwise not have been produced by big commercial studios. He was just very friendly, you know. We'd have coffee. This was mostly because somebody would be visiting, like a film programmer or a film critic that we both knew, you know, because I had that lucky opportunity to have traveled to several international festivals already in the 80s. So whenever there was this international guest, you know, he would call me, and, you know, even a couple of times invited me to lunch or dinner at his house with these guests, you know, or we would go out to a restaurant. So it was strange in a way, you know. I mean, Lino was not yet a national artist then, but you know, you looked up to him. You know, he was a highly celebrated Filipino filmmaker. It was very unusual. It was not that common yet to hear of a Filipino film in an international festival. There were other directors, of course, going to festivals, but it's not as common as today, where you can almost hear about a young Filipino filmmaker winning an award in some festival in some corner of the world. Back then, it was very few and far apart, you know. And Lino, of course, made that major mark because he was the very first Filipino to go to Cannes Film Festival in exhibition, in competition, followed by Mike De Leon eventually, you know. At the same time, I had already encountered and met Ishmael Bernal, who was also going to international festivals like Berlin and so on. So in a similar fashion, I was very lucky to have met Ishmael Bernal, even just right after my very first short film. When I made my short film in 1983 for the UP Film Center Cinema as Art workshop, I was invited to his house for a special dinner with the Manunuri, and that made me really very nervous, you know. With my very first short film, they wanted to see my short film. They wanted a kind of like a private viewing. Ishmael Bernal is closely collaborating with the University of the Philippines Film Center, and he's done activities with them, even documentaries, I believe, in as early as in the 70s. And so because of that close ties, he's probably heard about my film winning in the short film competition. And the title was Ang Magpakailanman. It was a 25-minute experimental silent film. And, it's probably heard a lot about it. There were some reviews that had come out. I believe one of the Manunuri members back then, Krip Yuson, was in the jury. That gave the award to that film, and he may have spoken about it. And then there was also Mario Hernando, who met early on back then. He may have spoken about it. And then there was also Mario Hernando, who met early on back then. He was quite impressed by the short film. So in fact, he was quite responsible in making that invitation for me to attend there, because at the same time, Ishmael Bernal was very curious to see my film because he did not have an opportunity to attend the short film screenings. So I had that very special evening of I brought the Super 8 projector and screened my very, very first film to Ishmael Bernal, at his home with the Manunuri watching. So it's an incredible experience for an 18-year-old filmmaker.
You were only 18?
I was 18 back then. Ishmael Bernal's films were also part of our study in the film workshops. Manila by Night, of course, was a study for us, deconstructing it and discussing it in the workshops and discussing all film elements. At the same time with other foreign films, Citizen Kane and all this usual fare that is, required for film students. So it was a very enriching experience to be in the workshop. But that evening with Ishmael Bernal, and the Manunuri was absolutely unforgettable for me. It was a big start for a very young, aspiring filmmaker.
Yeah, I can imagine. How did it go?
They seem to have enjoyed it. There was even a Q&A after. They were asking me questions, how I conceptualized it, and what else did I plan, or other details that I wanted to do that I wasn't able to do in the film. So actually they were very kind to me. So I had the opportunity to have a Q&A with distinguished cinema people, at a very early stage. So that really was a baptism of fire in a sense, because I was so rattled and nervous at that time, but at the same time I really felt proud about that. Just like Lino, Ishmael Bernal was very active in the different projects with the UP Film Center. Also, when there were outreach programs and seminars, particularly I remember going to outreach screenings and talks with Lino in the very late 80s.
Ano yung do outreach?
Outreach programs with the CCP when we already started showing our films and also doing like small seminars for students in the regions, you know. And I believe there were a couple that I attended with Lino. And then Ishmael, Bernal would do talks also at the Mole Fund Film Institute, where I already had begun working as a workshop coordinator and trainer. You know. So we were really planting the seeds for independent cinema. So there I was with my early body of short films, already inspiring these younger workshop attendees. You know, but at the same time, we had, you know, these giants, Lino and Ishmael Bernal, backing us up, you know, supporting these activities. It was a time when the movie industry was really beginning to recognize that there was something significant happening, you know, in this so-called underground or independent or alternative cinema. At the very least, to a lot of film practitioners, you know, movie industry workers, they would possibly look at it more as a, you know, an educational factor for cinema. You know, it's a breeding ground for new filmmakers who will eventually go into the movie industry. But at the same time, you would have people like Lino Brocka or Ishmael Bernal who recognizes the core essence of what alternative is. You know, that these filmmakers do not necessarily aim to be part of the mainstream, that they were trying to create cinema on their own, and that this cinema, as small as it may seem, was legitimate. You know, the experimental animation and all these short films, there were documentaries, narratives. It was essentially a cinema on its own, you know, and the venues and the audience was also alternative. So you reach out to film students, do screenings in film schools, and do outreach programs, and on its own, it's a system, you know, without needing to be part of what was the established mainstream. Yeah, if we look back, of course, the movie industry recognizes that Lino Brocka, Ishmael Bernal were filmmakers of the mainstream, of the movie industry, because essentially they were trying to change the industry from within. You know?
Yeah.
Whereas maybe alternative cinema was trying to create a new cinema and maybe create change from without, from outside of that mainstream. But technically speaking, I mean, Lino Brocka was an independent filmmaker, so was Ishmael Bernal. No? Lino early on even established his company and group Cine Manila.
Cine Manila, yeah.
Eventually, Mike De Leon also put up Cinema Artists. So they were all really reacting to what was happening in the mainstream. They realized the only way we could make the films we truly believed in was to do it independently, and those were legitimate independent production companies. So they were officially independent filmmakers. Alternative is another word, you know, and that's why I use it a little bit more formally for the movement that was kind of underground, because that's essentially what it is. It was creating an alternative to what is already accepted as the mainstream. Okay, I'm not absolutely sure how they were discovered, you know, but essentially the way it worked for international film festivals was the film scouts, as they would call them, or film programmers, would really travel around the world and try to watch as many films as they could, you know, and they discover these gems, you know, in those countries. You know. That was very pure in that sense, you know, unlike today where you can just send a screener or now just send your link, you know, and the submissions in a certain festival would be in the thousands, you know, like back then I would remember festivals would put out publicity and be proud that they had 500 submissions this year. Now we're talking 5,000 to 10,000 submissions, because of what the internet has provided. So it's very different. The programmers really went out of their way and flew out into these countries, and so there were film programmers who would come to the Philippines regularly, and basically they discovered who were the best. They saw Lino Brocka, Ishmael Bernal, and Mike De Leon, and several others. And then following them, of course, in this new wave, with Peque Gallaga, Marilu Diaz-Abaya, Joey Reyes, and all these other directors. They saw a path wherein you can work within the mainstream and work within the movie industry, and try to create new cinema and try to change it from within. And then the international eyes, saw this happening. And of course, it was happening in a very crucial time, during the martial law years, and so the eyes of the world were really on us on that. And I think cinema was a means to express, the reactions, the impressions, and the experiences, of people whose stories would otherwise not be told. And so I think that's what really appealed to a lot of the international film festivals. I think there's this need to really promote awareness of what these early filmmakers had really established for us, and built the foundations for us on cinema, because it would be sad to realize that a lot of the young filmmakers now who are now dabbling in filmmaking and cinema, and who call themselves film enthusiasts, would not even know who Lino Brocka is or Ishmael Bernal. That kind of activism, of course, was really provoked by the times. Martial law was a very specific situation for the Philippines at that time, and somehow that oppression and that struggle was the inspiration, for the kind of cinema that they were making, even though the films would not be outright, political statements and not direct attacks to the establishment. You can, see in their very essence, these kinds of films, Maynila sa mga kuko ng liwanag, Manila by Night, and all these other films. In its spirit, you can see that it was provoked by that situation. So now, we see the country again in somewhat in a turmoil, and we're quite divided, and now people are able to express their views and convictions, more openly because of social media and because of the internet. And it would be sad if we're not able to use that power, to express and show it in cinema, just the same way Lino and Ishmael did back then. I think for any artist, and any art form for that matter, inspiration would always be, a part of the creative process. So it's almost no one can claim that they have no inspiration from another artist, and especially the artists before them.
And artists that you knew
and especially artists that you had an affinity to because you personally known them. So my early films were very, very different, of course, from the kind of cinema that the so-called Philippine New Wave was creating, in the 70s. My generation, we had a lot of experimental filmmakers, being a visual artist. We were trying to experiment on the form itself. But at the same time, thoughts, ideals, and feelings are expressed even through abstract cinema, and I know that the sign of the times was expressed in these films as well. Eventually, if you're able to see the progression of my films, by the late 80s, I was dabbling already in narrative film and dramatic film. And definitely, I will not be able to deny that I was highly influenced by Bernal, Brocka, and Mike De Leon. They were really my inspirations. In fact, eventually, when I went back to short film in 1999 and 2000 to do Annina, I always admitted that it was actually a kind of a homage to Maynila sa mga kuko ng liwanag. When I started the film, in fact, the title was Maynila.
Really?
And what triggered that emotion in me to do this film was, in fact, having seen Maynila sa mga kuko ng liwanag again in 1999 when they were able to restore a print of it, and I saw a restored print that came from the British Film Institute, and I saw it twice. I believe it was shown in Manila, and then it was shown again at the Busan Film Festival, which I happened to be attending that year, and I was just so affected by the fact that seeing this film from 1975, it's almost as if nothing has changed for the country, and so I felt I wanted to express that, and Annina was the result of that. It's interesting, when I made Annina, it was really bits and pieces of what I was observing in my surroundings in society, and that people become objects, like a beggar or a little boy in the street, and all this squalor, and they become just settings and backdrops for our lives, if our lives were movies, and we become complacent about them. And so I wanted to show show something very visual, and that's why Annina feels that way. It's like, it almost feels like you don't know where the story is going, but it's basically an experience of the city. And I wanted to represent Manila again, and that's basically coming from that inspiration of seeing Maynila sa mga kuko ng liwanag, and that's why the Annina would have ended with the title Maynila earlier. I thought of the title Annina much later when I was already in post-production, because I realized the most powerful image in my film was these towering buildings that were overshadowing the slums, and so I felt everybody's living under the shadows of somebody more powerful. So it was really about that disparity of the powerful and the powerless, and that's essentially what you see in Maynila sa mga kuko ng liwanag, and nothing has changed.
Exactly.
And what really confirmed it and affirmed it for me was in 2000, actually, even before I thought of joining the Cannes Film Festival. I made this film really just to be able to show it, to express myself and show it to students, show it in UP, wherever I may be able to have an opportunity. I was lucky to have that special opportunity. There was this annual festival, Pelikula at Lipunan. It was organized by the Molfan Film Institute, by the director of the Film Institute back then, Nick De Ocampo, a film historian, filmmaker, documentarist. And that festival is non-competitive. It's really about cinema and society, and how we're affected by it. And so Pelikula at Lipunan was my opportunity to show Annina, and I was very lucky because Mike De Leon, who supervised a restoration of a print of Maynila sa mga kuko ng liwanag. At that time, the restoration was on print, on celluloid, not digital. They were going to show the the new print of Maynila sa mga kukunaliwanag at the Pelikula at Lipunan at the SM Mega Mall at the time. And they agreed that they were willing to show Annina in front of the film before Maynila. So it was an amazing opportunity for me to premiere Annina. So that was actually the world premiere of Annina, not in Cannes.
Oh, interesting.
It was shown before Maynila sa mga kukunaliwanag, and one of the most of course flattering comments by one of the audiences, I believe he was a professor, when after the screening he came up to me and said, "What Maynila said in 2 hours, you said in 12 minutes." And basically you see that whole conflict and lesson there, that nothing has really changed for a lot of people. You know, the same struggle, the same conditions is still happening, and that disparity between, it's not really about rich and poor, but it's the powerful and the powerless. And the theme of the film was really that. There were a lot of images in Maynila sa mga kukunaliwanag which, I have to admit, were really inspirational. And so when I was walking around Manila, old Manila, to film my scenes with Ronnie Lazaro, the Julio Madyaga character was really in my mind. And in fact, there was one specific shot in Annina that was intentionally an homage to Maynila, when the opening scene of Maynila, where we see Bembol Rocco leaning, at the post and looking up to the window. I had one shot in Annina specifically with Ronnie Lazaro doing that, and that was, that was an intentional homage, and I actually hope people notice that. Definitely these films, let's say in particular, Maynila sa mga kukunan liwanag, Manila by Night by Ishmael Bernal. I mean, these films are classics now, and their message is just as strong as ever. The dilemma right now, as I see it, especially now that I'm teaching film, to a younger generation, is the lack of a deeper insight to what this cinema represents. There's a tendency to always look at what is trendy and what is the in thing, and it's just like fashion. Cinema goes in different cycles, and so generations of today would tend to like only what is trendy for them, and that's why one of the most important things I always tell my students is that you need to watch a classic film or an older film in the context of the time it was made. That was the only way you can give it respect and truly understand and absorb it. Because it's difficult when you see, let's say, a period film, or a film that was shot so many decades back. To you, it looks like a period film that's not made the way you want it. That's not made in the trend of today, right? So you need to understand the context of how it was made back then. That means you have to have that insight for the history of it, and that's what I always push for. And I think that's what I learned, even early on, as an 18-year-old making a short film way back. I was watching films like Citizen Kane and Metropolis from 1927, So I needed to understand how these films were made and why they were made and how the filmmakers thought back then and what was the political climate at that time, And that's the only way I realize I appreciate it. So, I tell my students, I don't watch old films because you think I'm an old guy, that I like old films. I wasn't born yet when Metropolis or Citizen Kane was made, In a way, even Lino Brocka's early cinema of the 70s with Bernal and Mike De Leon was not even my generation. I was in grade school back then, and probably wasn't even allowed to enter the cinema for these types of films. So I saw these after the fact in the early 80s when I was starting to study art and art history and filmmaking. They weren't very old yet, but I was trying to see the vision behind them, when they were made 5 or 6 years earlier than my time at when I was in the film workshops. And I understood that because that's when my eyes were open to what was happening in the 70s. I was just a kid having fun and going to school, but then I realized, so now I understand what exactly was happening growing up as a martial law baby, and that's how I appreciated these films. And so I hope the new generation views these films in that light, in that perspective, and with that insight of history. I saw Manila by Night, yeah, on a Betamax copy because we had to watch it for the workshop. So that was back in 1982, 83, when I was in the Cinema as Art workshops at the UP Film Center. And we were studying these classic films along with Maynila sa mga Koko ng Liwanag. So I didn't have the opportunity to see them on the big screen, and I will always, I've always believed in the respect for cinema and that, and I still hold on to that, tradition. I believe cinema, classic cinema should be, the way it's viewed on a bigger screen, in a darkened theater. So I've always, been frustrated by the fact that I had to see these classic films on VHS, Betamax, eventually, when there were film revivals and special festivals, like I said, the Pelikula at Lipunan and so on, the tradition of restoring films and rejuvenating film prints, and screening them on the big screen has created that awareness, for the preservation of the cinema heritage, and I've always believed in that, and so I really took the opportunity to go out and watch these films again on the big screen, because there were many film revivals even in the cultural center of the Philippines and so on. So I've seen these films several times, but as I've said, one of the momentous times I saw it on the big screen was with the restored print from the British Film Institute, which was very, very good colors, very, very pristine, clean print, and I was able to see that print shown both in Manila and at the Busan Film Festival. When I saw Manila by Night, to be quite frank, at that time, it actually felt more impressive than Maynila sa Koko ng Liwanag. Maynila sa mga Koko ng Liwanag was very, very dramatic and very, heartbreaking. It was a very depressing film. Manila by Night had its moments of that, but what's interesting was that the film structure, that the whole story happened in one night, and it basically gave you a window to what Manila is, and what the Philippines is, and I found that concept kind of almost experimental. I mean, it was unusual to see in a Filipino film, coming from all these very commercial movie industry formulas. So to me, that was a real eye-opener, and at the same time quite inspiring. Of course, at that time I was still really dabbling in experimental visual cinema, and so my early films tended to be more visual than emotional. Then again, I guess I learned from these classic films that there was pure emotion even through the visuals, and I think that's what I've always imbibed, in my films. I'm a cinematographer as well, so I shoot my own films, and I always feel I'm still a painter when I'm making films. I'm painting with light and colors and shadows and highlights. But at the same time, it's not just physical and visual and cerebral. It's, to me, it's also emotional, and I think I've learned to show those emotions and the dramatic elements of cinema mainly purely visually, even without dialogue. And I've always liked cinema that way. Manila by Night had a lot of dialogue, but to me, what really struck me also was it was quite visual, and you get a real feeling of the city. It's almost like you went through that journey of one whole night through Manila, and then ending up in the morning at the CCP, where people are starting to do their exercise and jogging. It was quite an experience, to watch the film, and you feel that it's exactly that. It was an experience. It was almost like a personal experience when you watch it. My impression always of mainstream Filipino movies or Tagalog movies was always that it was very commercial and very formulaic, and admittedly at that time, as a young student, I looked down on Filipino cinema, but I realized upon finally seeing Lino Brocka and Ishmael Bernal and I realized I was missing a lot. That growing up in the 70s, that these movies were happening, and eventually, of course, also discovering American cinema and all that. Some of my favorites, of course, are The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, which was by Coppola, The Deer Hunter. All these movies coming out of the 70s. It was a very interesting time for world cinema, and I realized that Philippines was coming to the forefront as well, and in fact started to get highly recognized. Of course, before the generation of Lino Brocka, there were already directors who gained acclaim in international festivals. Manuel Conde with his Genghis Khan was one of the first Filipino films in the Venice Film Festival, and Lamberto Avellana, Eddie Romero, they had begun that era of the golden age of Filipino cinema. But in the 70s was really a turning point, because that was the time that we really started going to the top tier festivals, like Cannes and Berlin and so on. So we all kind of looked up to that, realizing and seeing these films in the early 80s as a young student. I really said to myself that I'd been missing a lot, and finally I was an adult, with a frame of mind, ready to appreciate these films, and so from that point on, I just kept on watching movies, Filipino cinema and international cinema. Definitely, I was starting to get in touch with the movie industry, even though I was not part of it. Also, being part of the Mobile Fund Film Institute, the Mobile Fund Film Institute is actually part of the Mother Foundation, which is the welfare foundation. It's put up by the movie industry and for the movie industry, and so we were always somehow in touch, and in those early years, I remember that we would try to visit film sets, and to see how these mainstream movies were made, And I remember visiting a few. I can't remember now if I was able to visit what specific films of Ishmael, but we were always in touch.
You visited the set of Ishmael?
I can't remember now which ones. I visited several sets because we become in touch with many industry professionals, and sometimes they'd allow film students or young filmmakers to observe. So, but I do remember visiting many sets, even I forget now. So, I think I visited the set of forget the movie. Sorry,
80s.
wait.
Bernal.
I don't remember specifically now, but we were visiting sets even with Gil Portes, with
So together with them?
no, I mean
the sets of Gil
the
Portes.
sets of
Okay.
I know I visited one time Marilio Diaz-Abaya shooting,
Mm-hmm.
and then I visited the set of Phil Cortez. I visited the set of forget what movie that was. It's strange. I don't remember now if I specifically visited the set of Lino or Ishmael Bernal. I'm kind of confused now. They were also working on TV. I may have visited one time in a set on TV. Eventually I realized that in the late 80s, Lino, Brocka, as well as Ishmael Bernal started doing television commercials as well. So it's a different industry of cinema in a sense. I mean, TV commercials are part of cinema. And I know that they become very successful in that, an industry that I eventually entered myself as well. Back in the early 90s, I started a career in TV commercials. So, what's interesting is in TV commercials, the budgets were much bigger considering they were short, in a way, short films. Like 30-second stories with quite a big budget. So you get to practice your craft. You get to practice cinema language with better equipment, better resources, and with the money I earned in that industry, I was able to make my personal films, and so I kind of used that to finance my own personal projects. So I'm not sure if Lino or Ishmael did it as well, primarily to support their own personal projects, or that if they really had that intense passion to try this kind of cinema, in a sense, the storytelling in 30 seconds, and then essentially recognizing the main goal of that, which is to sell a product. It's a very specific type of cinema. So I've learned to appreciate that through the years, and that's why I've made a successful career in that. However, my passion and my heart really belongs to personal cinema, and so I was able to straddle on both industries, and in a way use the earnings I had with TV commercials to be able to finance my otherwise difficult to fund personal projects. In the 80s, there was this frustration that the movie industry, or even Philippine cinema as a whole, was kind of going down. But I feel that Lino Brocka was fighting till the very end. His last film was Ora Pro Nobis, which had an international distribution, and that was his next stage, to go international. And in fact, at the time he died, he had signed up with an international production company in the US already. So that would have been the next stage. He would have been an early Ang Lee, or an international Asian director.
Wow.
Penetrating Hollywood. It was very unfortunate that that tragic accident happened. So it ended his career, his life, very early on. He was also one of the first awardees of the Hubert Ball's grant. It's a very prestigious grant that was given at the Rotterdam Film Festival in the Netherlands. And I believe he had a special project being developed already with that grant, and again, he wasn't able to do it, because of his early death. I was fortunate to be the second grantee. I received a grant from the Hubert Balls in 1993, 2 years after Lino's death. Strangely, I still haven't made that film. My proposal at that time was Makapili, and I'm still struggling to get that project off the ground. still trying to find money. So the grant was just a seed money to develop the project. But I've set my eyes on doing that project now. So anyway, when I look back at that grant, I can't escape the fact that I was really inspired by Lino. He was always spearheading the movement, and it's always ahead of everyone else, and trying to open doors for others as well. So during that time, I wouldn't say he was giving up. He in fact had one of the most powerful films, which was banned at the time. That's why very few people saw it, Ora Pro Nobis. But it was released commercially on DVD, Laserdisc. So it was a full-fledged international film, and that was the next stage for him. Now it's commonplace. You see it everywhere. Fast forward today. My son is more successful than me in that arena now. They're able to pitch through these pitching events, getting these bigger grants now to produce their films, and they're making ties with distribution and linking with all these new distribution networks and distribution platforms. My son Michael Red, his Birdshot film, which was sent for the Oscar consideration. It was actually the first Filipino content available internationally on Netflix. So that was a pioneering success. So you're seeing it happening now, but see, back then it was a real struggle, and so we always admired filmmakers like Lino and Ishmael for really doing groundbreaking work and spearheading these moves, which actually allowed for other filmmakers like us, to follow their footsteps. Yeah, I look back with with a lot of amusement as well. Like I even had a lecture in the Film Development Council at their Cinematheque. If you've ever visited their Cinematheque in Manila, at the lobby you will see the statues of our national artists for cinema, Lino Brocka, Ishmael, Bernal, Eddie Romero, and so on. And so when I did lectures there, I always told people, I can't believe, all those statues out there, I met them. They were people. They were not statues. They were, they were, soulful human beings whom I met, whom I heard speak, and I was able to absorb and imbibe what they were teaching. So I was lucky. I said I was lucky. I witnessed these great filmmakers when they were really alive and working as true artists.
Do you think Lino and Ishma were teachers at heart?
I believe so. They're always there's always the saying that not everybody can be a teacher, but I guess a practitioner, a professional, will always find a way to share his knowledge. I never thought I can be a teacher, but early on I was a teacher. So having listened to great masters like Lino and Ishma in the early 80s, I immediately was hired in 1985 at the Mole Fun Film Institute. So I started teaching Super 8 filmmaking back then. And one of my earliest students in Super 8 was Love Diaz.
Oh, really?
So he was in the very first workshop that I taught for Super 8, and eventually many of these directors, established directors now, were my students at the Molfan Film Institute workshops. Mark Maley, Yam Laranas. They're now working in the movie industry. And many others. And so, I look back in amusement because I kind of try to wish I were still young, but I always feel young, and I always felt that they were my colleagues and they were not my students really. They were colleagues, and they are colleagues now. We're all filmmakers, so they're good friends. Mark Bailey and Love Diaz and Yam Laranas and all these other independent filmmakers. From that generation, some of them remain more underground, independent, or more in touch with the art scene. Like Rox Lee, who's an animator. So we were in that same generation in the early '80s. And he's still a painter now. So it's from that circle of independent filmmakers, and definitely I believe none of them can deny that we were highly influenced by that early generation of the new wave of filmmakers, which included Lino, Brocka, Ishmael, Bernal, and Mike De Leon, and many others. The Welfare Foundation was founded in 1974. The Film Institute was established in 79, at the time when the UP Film Center was also already very active with film workshops. Then, of course, we have to acknowledge that the different colleges, universities had their own somewhat film programs. Although they were not formal film programs, they would be under broadcast communications, communication arts, and so on. La Salle was very active already back then. Ateneo had its own, and there was like a tie-up with these institutions, including government institutions like the Cultural Center, plus all these other foreign institutions, Alliance Francaise, Goethe Institute, German Cultural Center, and many others. There would be a linkage, and these were actually venues for alternative cinema to be able to exhibit. And I do remember that whenever filmmakers like Lino or Ishmael or Mike De Leon had the time, they would attend these events. In fact, in the first independent film and video festival that was organized by Nick De Ocampo under the Molfan Film Institute, that was in 1986. Lino and Ismael Bernal, they were very supportive. They lent out their films, they screened it there, and Mike De Leon was there with his very first. It was a pioneering, groundbreaking video feature. It wasn't digital yet because the technology of recording was not digital; it was still tape. But they had the pioneering vision with Sony Philippines to produce the first video, full-length feature to be screened in the Wave Cinema at that time. That's where we held our festival. Unfortunately, it was a short-lived cinema. It lasted maybe 2 years or so, but it was ahead of its time. Sony thought maybe the future of cinema would be through electronic projection and instead of film, celluloid. And that's why they did a pilot project with Mike De Leon and produced Bilanggo sa Dilim. It was a really groundbreaking full-length feature shot on video and projected in that cinema, and it premiered in that festival, the first independent film and video festival. Again, if you're able to research that, you'll see big names from the movie industry who supported it. So it proves their belief in that there was a future in independent cinema and alternative cinema. All these big names, Lamberto Avellana, Eddie Romero, and most of them were board members of the Molfan Film Institute anyway, and then of course the filmmakers themselves, lending their films to be screened in these special programs of the film festival. it's not every day that you hear about somebody as lucky as me who was an aspiring filmmaker and had that rare opportunity to be actually in touch with giants like Lino, Brocka, Ishmael, Bernal, and many of these other directors who created that foundation for Philippine cinema. So I think we should all contribute to creating that awareness for the heritage of Philippine cinema. Just as much as we're so engrossed now in pushing cinema forward and trying new approaches, experimenting in new ways, and finding a new language and all that. That's the way really to move forward with cinema. But we always say that it's important to know our linkage and the roots of where we're coming from, so that we know better where to take this, to push this art form. And so it's just right to pay homage to these masters, our national artists for cinema, and continue to study their cinema. And like I always remind young people to appreciate these films and watch them in the true context of the time they were made, and in that way we learn the history of the social conditions, not only the cinema itself, but of society itself. Through the years, there's always been a lot of arguments with film critics and historians and film theorists, of who is a better filmmaker. I think it's always difficult because we get, our own perceptions and our own impressions and tastes will always affect our judgment. So there are some critics who are saying Lino, Brocka has been really put on a higher pedestal, and yet they feel maybe Ishmael, Bernal deserves better. But I think that the important thing is that we recognize them both as national artists for cinema. Their cinema had a close affinity, and they almost seemed similar, but at the same time, when you really look deep into their films, they're quite different. You can see the style, the language, the film grammar of each filmmaker when you see the films. And so we have to give it equal respect. I do have to admit, I've been invited twice to this every 10-year cinema poll made by the British Film Institute. They create a poll worldwide from critics, filmmakers, educators, and so on, and to come up with the best 100 films ever made, and basically you're asked to give your 10 best. And I always say it's always difficult to make a list. I try not to believe in these lists because it your perception is very different depending on what aspect of cinema you want to judge it on, or what context of cinema you want to name certain films. So it's always difficult. But since I was invited, I had to give the 10 best, and that's of world cinema. And I have to admit, I really admire a lot of international cinema and a lot of American cinema because I grew up with that, and also some European cinema. A little bit more of Asian cinema, which tends to be always Japanese films, Kurosawa and so on. But I had to put in one Filipino film, and it was very painful whether to put a Brocka or an Ishmael Bernal or a Mike De Leon film, who were actually my favorites. And of course, I admire other Filipino directors, so many others, but it's a painful task, that you have to make a list of only 10 films. I eventually added only one Filipino film, and it was Ishmael Bernal. And I added Himala as one of my best 10. It's always difficult to explain that, but that was in my list, and I think the lists are still published at the BFI. I believe there's an archive there, and you can actually see my list.